For the consideration of the Coven of Il-Tarash, blessed be the name. I, Agent Shazar, have discovered information of great value that I wish to submit to the Codex. Information that could weaken the grip of the Church over the people they rule with neither mandate nor mercy. We are all familiar with the tale of the death of Queen Almetra of Old-Yultam. The tale, as we know it, is that Queen Almetra ruled over her kingdom well until revolt, led by the first Hierophant, Valdaz Gilat, toppled her rule. So strong was his hatred of the arcane that he declared no punishment can be too severe for the practice of magic, and so he ordered her flayed and then burned alive. However, the Radiant One, Tal Orothi, Lady of Light, blessed be her name, intervened and took Almetra into her palace in the realm of dreams. This version of the tale is told in the lands of the Church as well, though in their telling, Almetra was a ruthless tyrant, and she does not survive. And I have read yet other tellings of the tale, written by historians of the Church earlier in their history, that indicate that Valdaz was simply following the punishment of the Queen for the crime of treason within her lands. I can report that all of these tales are a fiction. I have entered the deepest libraries of the Church, where they keep the journals of Valdaz. I have read the truth. Valdaz was a bureaucrat for the Queen, and saw her taken by a madness. She went from a largely benevolent monarch to an iron-fisted tyrant, who treated her subjects and servants both with immense cruelty. She had had a difficult life and had finally caught up with her. Valdaz seems to have had no intention of executing her at all, but due to the allies he had secured to help win his revolt, he had no choice. And she was not executed by flaying and then burning. In her paranoia, Almetra had enchanted her skin so that it would not crack, her blood so that it would not flow from her veins. Valdaz tried to have her beheaded, but the blow of the axe would not pierce the skin. His journals read with great sadness. He wrote, "Am I truly left no choice but to consign her to the fire? It is an accursed foundation for a new realm, that it be built on the ashes of the last kingdom to stand upon it. And yet, I fear I have no other option. I shall have the apothecary prepare a sleeping draught. Let us pray that she has not rendered herself immune, even to them." Hello, and welcome to the Worldbuilding Institute. I'm Matthew, and today we're going to continue talking about fantasy horror. If you're watching this video, I'd recommend watching my fantasy horror worldbuilding basics video and religion videos first. I'll link them both in the description. At the same time, most of the video will make some sort of sense without them, but they may give you some sort of idea into the process that was involved in world building before we get to this bit. Today I want to talk about history and religion in fantasy horror settings. How can we use these systems to make a darker, more horrifying world? Stick with me and I'll talk you through it. Very quickly before we begin, my new intention is to upload a video every Friday if I can. You can check the About section of my channel page to see my schedule for the month. The plan is to do 2 videos on my main project, that's this series for the time being, and 2 miscellaneous videos. I have pre-ordered Tasha's, so I should be doing a review of that, but it may be delayed in Europe, so maybe not. If not, I'll do a deep dive on the most recent Unearthed Arcana. And I'm going to be starting a series about different types of villains. In particular, I'm going to be looking at rival archetypes in the first video of that. So remember to subscribe and ring that bell if those sound interesting to you. Okay, with that out of the way, we can turn our attention to part 1. Look back in anger. We're going to start with history. Now, I'm sure many of you are thinking, history isn't scary, and yeah, you're mostly correct. A lot of history is just boring lists of names and dates, and even spooky events like the Roanoke colony disappearance are creepy, but not scary. This is because history is distant. Its events happened a long time ago, and thus it can be pretty hard to feel threatened by it. But there is some interesting philosophy about history that we need to very briefly discuss. Put simply, there is no neutral history. There is an objective truth to what happened in the past, but humans are often completely incapable of knowing it. History, then, is a form of storytelling, And this is where it becomes useful for us. There are other ways of understanding it. Hegelian dialectics is a way of understanding history, but history as storytelling is perhaps a bit more useful in a world-building capacity. Understanding history in this way allows you to create multiple interpretations of the same events, and this is extremely important as history informs culture, which in turn is one of the two key factors that contribute towards determining laws and realms and kingdoms and tradition. So you see, history itself isn't horrifying, but we need to understand it to build a world at present that is. History can start traditions that persist even if religions change. Consider, for example, the Samhain celebrations in it's on the screen, it's in Perthshire. The religion in the region has been predominantly Christian since around the 7th century, yet they still honour the... God's sake, Scotland. The Kailich? I don't know how you pronounce that either, it's on the screen. Something that this tradition started after the arrival of Christianity, though others believe it could span centuries, and it is still important enough to be observed annually, despite the death of the religion that inspired it, the Gallic faith. Different interpretations of history can lead to conflicts even hundreds of years down the line as well. People can dispute claims, and it's not uncommon for people to engage in war because of differing interpretations of history. Famously, Henry VIII of England claimed that his crown was an imperial crown, which would give him more authority than the Pope, despite the fact that England had never had a real emperor. They had fictional emperors, and that was history enough in the 1500s. This is where history becomes useful for nations and individuals. It allows people to create myths that they can use to justify their actions. We also need to consider the absence of elements in history, and the effects that this can have upon the world. This one in particular is really useful for fantasy horror. Having big dark spots is great. History is often treated as certain, so having these large empty periods in history where people don't really know what happened can be really helpful. Not only because they give you stories to tell, people trying to find out what happened in these blank spots, but they also create a sense of uncertainty which can, in turn, promote a sense of dread. The Dark Souls franchise excel at this. I'm almost certainly going to do a video about the world building in Dark Souls at some point. It's really good. Dark Souls 2 in particular deals with uncertain history. It has some really creepy moments and ideas. When and why did the Duke of the Writhing Ruins release Freya and her spiders upon the townfolk? What did King Vendrick take from the giants and why? How long ago did any of this even happen? Hell, you speak to one guy, Strayed of Alaphis. He says no one but him even remembers his homeland. This confusion of time and history creates a really interesting atmosphere that is at times somber and at times genuinely unsettling. And you can use the same uncertainty to create the same emotions. Sadness in horror often becomes hopelessness, and creating that atmosphere in your world can really prime your audience for the spooks when they begin. So this is all well and good, but I also want to very quickly lay out a bit of general writing advice for history. So when you're designing a timeline, I would recommend starting with your world's current state. Then you need to know its beginning and any key historical events that need to happen in order for your story to happen. Then work your way from the present backwards. Build the timeline so that each non-natural event has clear cause and effect progression. I make that distinction because obviously, like, volcanic eruptions do have causes, but they're not interesting in the same way that human ones are. You can't really log them. So you create an event, then you create the events that caused that, and then you create the events that caused them, etc., etc., all the way back to your beginning, to the root of your world. This should help make everything feel a bit more solid and will root your world in a realistic causal sequence, which should allow you to predict what will happen next. Obviously, that's a lot of work, but it's definitely worth doing if you can. If not, I recommend doing at least 2 steps back from each event. So you have the event you want to talk about, you have the cause of that event, and then you have the cause of the cause. That way, if people ask any questions or whatever, you can say, oh, that was because of this, and if they say, yeah, but what caused that, you can then say, well, that was because of this, and that will exhaust most players' curiosity. I've never been asked for more than 2 steps, even when I've done the whole timeline, which is really annoying. I would also recommend dividing your timeline into great ages, and give each great age a key theme. It's a fairly organic way to divide the history of your world, and it can give you a sense of the style of the period, and the key institutions and ideas that drove it forward. In our world, for example, we had late antiquity, the themes of which could be described as the collapse of empire, decadence, and the rise of religious power. This was followed by the Dark Ages and their themes of great wars, pestilence, and religious rule, which was in turn followed by the Renaissance and its themes of the pursuit of knowledge, the decline of religious authority, and great works of art. Now, you might say, that's not how those eras were divided, but it basically is. We present it as objective because we like to think of history that way, but that's a fallacy. History is a form of storytelling, so we divide things up by theme. Obviously as well, this example is quite Eurocentric, but many cultures talk of golden ages and dark ages. As I said, history is a form of storytelling, and these divisions are really useful chapter markers for the story of your world and your people. So the history you create does not need to include anything particularly horrifying in and of itself, but it needs to lay the groundwork for the horror in your setting. In my previous video, I laid some of the basics out for my own fantasy horror setting, Karamir. I'm going to continue working on that here to lay out the techniques I've explored previously. So, first things first, I'm going to do a key event. I'm only going to do the one and just do 2 steps back from it. So, we're going to talk about the Revolt of Valdaz, which you heard a report on at the beginning of this video. Valdaz was a bureaucrat who worked for Queen Almetra of Yoltem. He noticed increasingly erratic behaviour, such as hoarding food and waging pointless, costly wars against the neighbouring realm of Eratria, which was causing untold suffering to the people of the nation, and rallied with other members of the lower nobility to overthrow her. The upper nobility of Yoltem and most of the kingdoms in Karamir at this point in history were dominated by women. The lower nobility tended to be sons, so it tended to be the men, which made it easier to recruit them for a revolt that risked toppling the power structure, because the upper limits of that power structure weren't accessible to them. So the 2 key causes of this event are the madness of Queen Almetra, which does not necessarily need an explanation, as it's a natural event, though in her case, it's because she'd had quite a traumatic life. But even so, that in and of itself isn't a particularly useful way of viewing things, so we have to continue through the historical line of the war with Eratria, which had historically been an ally of Yoltem. So for what reason did the Queen go to war with her allies? Simple. Almetra's mother was murdered on the order of the Queen of Eratria, as part of a plot to have her daughter, Almetra's cousin, inherit the kingdom. So the primary cause of the war was the long-standing tradition of marriage alliances between the ruling families of Yoltem and Eratria, which resulted in a claim existing for the heir of Eratria on the kingdom of Yoltem. The wars crippled Yoltem's military and made it easier for the rebels to capture the Queen. So with that specific historical event laid out, you then move on out and divide your timeline into ages. So for Karamir, we have 3 great ages. The Sanguine Age, the age in which the Radiant Ones lived upon the world. Large sections of this period of history are completely unknown. There were civilizations ruled over directly by the Radiant Ones as gods, and monarchs simultaneously, but not too much is known about this period in general, which is why it doesn't necessarily have themes. This age ended when the Radiant Ones ascended into the realm of dreams using magic. Then we have the High Age, with its themes of prosperity, progress, and great magical power, and it was in turn followed by the Age of Decay, which had themes of revolt, loss of knowledge, and inequality. The Revolt of Valdaz is generally considered the beginning of the Age of Decay. So that's how I would build some of a history for a fantasy horror setting. And you can always include little notes about the horror or brutality of certain events. For example, the Revolt of Valdaz ends with a really brutal execution, but it is perhaps better in terms of creating horror to distill past events down into the present, to have the consequences of the past trickle into the societies that your players will interact with. And frankly, the best way to have the past affect the present is Part 2, Finding Your Religion. Now, I've already done a full video on religion, and the history section is way longer than I intended when I planned this video out, so I'm going to keep this bit relatively brief. Basically, horror comes from the tangible impact an institution has on the world. So what are the consequences of the religion that inspire horror, and where does that horror come from? In my religions video, I talk about rituals and celebrations, and this, I would say, is where the horror of religious institutions tend to shine through. Now, equally, you can use religion to contrast from the monstrosities of the outside world, and having that place of relative peace and safety can be useful. But it's much easier to build a religion like that, as that's how most real-world religions present themselves, than a horrifying religion. So what sort of things do you need to include in a religion to make it feel horrifying? There are two main styles here. The first is the secretive approach, a religion that serves a horrifying god or pantheon that manipulates things from behind the scenes, operates in secret. This can be deeply unsettling. The rituals may be bizarre or alien, and they may spread fear by kidnapping citizens to sacrifice, or bringing ruin to those who cross members of the cult. They may serve monsters that dwell in the mortal realm, hidden away, or they may be performing the steps they believe necessary to preserve the world against the horrors that seek to end it. An example of these could be the Cult of Cthulhu in the Lovecraft mythos, or the Dark Brotherhood and Mythic Dawn from the Elder Scrolls. These religions are almost always smaller and closer to a secret society than a religion as we think of them. That being said, there are some pretty good examples of quite large secret religious institutions like this. The cult in The Shadow over Innsmouth, for example, is an entire town. It's pretty big. On the other side of this is openly horrifying religions. These are religions with a great deal of power that dominate the culture or nation they operate in, and that can implement or create changes to the law on a whim. They may well be the government of a nation, or be able to act on their own, violating the laws of the kingdom they operate within. We're talking here about your Church of the Eternal Fire from The Witcher, the Church of the Everyman from Dishonored, or, super weirdly, the Jedi Order in the Star Wars prequels? Because they can, legally kidnap children to raise them in an environment of cruelty and restraint and commit, war crimes without legal consequences. Looking at you, Anakin, I know you don't like sand, but you don't have to be racist against the sand people. A real-world example of this would probably be the Aztec religion, which justified conquest of its neighbours to rip their hearts out in order to offer them to the sun god to keep the sun moving through the sky. Obviously, there are places where these kind of cross over, religions with inner circles that operate on different rules, that kind of thing, but those are generally the main two ways of portraying them. Your primary focus for making them horrifying needs to answer two questions. What horrible thing do they do, and why do they do it? I'm going to give you a rundown to each of these questions from one of each type of religion on Karamir, using a ritual and celebration from both in order to explore it. There's a lot more to designing a religion than rituals and celebrations, but that's all in the religions video. A lot of people seem to find it quite helpful, so maybe go check it out. Shameless self-promotion done. And I'm going to do a content warning for this next section. It does include references to sexism, forced hysterectomies, infanticide, and torture, fairly graphic descriptions thereof. So if you don't want to listen to any of that, please skip ahead to the very end of the section. I'll put a timestamp in the doobly-doo. First up, we're going to talk about the Church of the Black Seal. As I established in the last video, these are one of the monsters of the setting. They are a nation-state combined with a religion, so they fall into the second category. They are hyper-misogynistic and incredibly punitive against mages. The Church's tenets assert that the spiritual is innately wicked, that women are more easily susceptible to the spiritual, and therefore they need to be watched by the less easily corruptible men, which is kind of a fallacy. Women can reach greater heights of magical power in this setting, but men can be mages too, and they are both easily susceptible to the worst of the arcane. The society that results from this is one with truly horrifying gender inequality, even by medieval standards. Frequent executions, women enslaved by powerful priests, ritual hysterectomies for women unfortunate enough to be born with magic, and then choose to join the church in order to avoid being killed. All in all, they're pretty evil, even to their own members. So the ritual I'm going to lay out for them is the rite of castigation. This is used when a member of the clergy breaks the rules of the faith or otherwise fails to complete a duty he has been assigned. And it is always a he. If a female member of the clergy somehow manages to break the rules because they live in, effectively monastery prisons, they're just executed immediately. When a member of the clergy breaks one of the rules of the faith, he is taken to a cell, stripped, tied with his hands to the ceiling, and has the nature of the castigation, that is the written warning basically, carved into his back with a heated knife. A line is then carved beneath it. If a member of the church acquires 3 castigations, then they are excommunicated from the church and executed by hanging. Their corpse is left at the gate of the church to remind parishioners that no one is above the church's law. And the celebration I'm going to lay out is the Queenfell Feast. So on the anniversary of Queen Almetra's execution, in every city with a cathedral, a witch is selected, or an effigy made in the unlikely event that they don't have a witch prisoner currently, which the bigger cities almost always do. They are dressed as the queen and paraded through the town to be heckled and beaten, and led to a pyre. Once there, they are flayed and then burned alive. A great feast is cooked over the ashes of the fire and distributed to the townsfolk. This is to celebrate the founding of the church and to encourage mages to abandon their wickedness by publicly demonstrating the consequences of witchcraft. It also serves to shore up civilian loyalty. The lands of the church don't have as much food as a lot of their neighbours because they refuse to use magic to help the crops grow. As a result, events like this, where the church feeds people, make the church very popular. So, that is the church done. I'm now going to talk about a secret religion. I'm going to talk about the cult of the Waxon. They worship the Radiant One Tal Orothi, Lady of Light, known in the lands of the church as the Candlemaker. It is one of the few radiant worshipping faith that does not explicitly favour women, in no small part because of the initiation, the Ritus Serra, which is what I'm going to talk about now. So a supplicant wishing to join the cult must bring 2 sacrifices. The first, something that represents the death of themselves as they are, and the second, a human infant, representing the new life that they shall be given. These cults all keep a vast tub of molten wax at their heart, magically kept molten by runes carved into the bottom. The offering representing death is placed inside first. This is normally dirt from a grave or a chip of a tombstone, that kind of thing. Then the infant's throat is cut and its blood is mixed with the wax. The initiate strips naked and enters the wax, fully submerging themselves in it. The rest of the cult perform a chant and each offer a part of their flesh and utter an incantation. When they leave the wax, the initiate has been transformed into a Waxon, a creature that can change its shape. I will probably play 5th edition D&D in this setting. It basically changes your race to a changeling. This ritual allows the cult to continue to operate with the utmost secrecy, and to spread the word of Tal Orothi without detection. The only way to spot a Waxon is the sensation of their skin, which feels like a candle to the touch. And also, if they are too near fire, they will begin to kind of lose their shape. The celebration I'm going to discuss for the cult of Tal Orothi is the Night of the Blessed Moon. It falls on the 5th full moon of the year. During the Night of the Blessed Moon, the cult all change to become faceless, sexless beings and commence a hunt against the lightless, those who deny the divinity of Tal Orothi. A target is selected by the leader of the cult and then the hunt begins. All members of the cult attempt to kill the target by sunrise, the successful member being declared leader of the cult for the next year. These rituals and celebrations communicate the key themes of the religions and also establish a physical threat in the world, which will keep audiences on their toes if they know that one event is approaching or occurring. Okay, that's all for this video. If you enjoyed it, please like, share and subscribe. Tune in next week for a hopefully shorter video where I talk about villains, particularly the rival type, which I think particularly in tabletop RPGs is an underused arc, because it can be really good. It will lay the framework for the series that I want to do about villains and different types of villains and how to do them well. I've been Matthew, you've been watching the Worldbuilding Institute. Goodbye.